The air that filled their lungs was cold and sterile, tasting of ozone and antiseptic. It was the first clean breath Julian had taken in 2 years, and it felt like a betrayal. Pneumatic doors hissed shut behind them, sealing off the dust and decay of the world they had just left. The light was a flat, shadowless blue-white that hummed from recessed panels, making the grime under his fingernails look like a terminal disease. A woman in a crisp white uniform handed him a set of pale blue scrubs. The fabric was thin, impersonal. He changed, the clean material hanging loose on his gaunt frame, a shroud on a skeleton. Across the small decontamination chamber, Maja pulled a similar jumpsuit over her travel-worn clothes, refusing to part with them. The sterile blue only made her look more like a piece of the broken outside world, a feral thing brought into a cage. Ren, pale and silent in a wheelchair, allowed a medic to drape a clean blanket over her legs, her gaze sharp and critical, a nurse's assessment that found everything wanting. They were led into a vast white atrium. The space was cathedral-like, echoing with the quiet hum of air filtration and the distant whir of machinery. It was designed to inspire awe, to project an image of order reclaimed from chaos. Julian felt a tremor of it, a deep, dangerous hope. Julian, my God, you made it. The voice was a balm from a former life. Dr. Aegis Thorne stepped forward, his hand outstretched. He was exactly as Julian remembered, late 50s, well-rested, his lab coat a brilliant, almost painful white. His silver-rimmed glasses caught the clinical light. He was the embodiment of the world Julian had been crawling back towards. Julian took his hand. Thorne's grip was firm, paternal. Aegis, we made it. I never doubted you for a moment, Thorne said, his smile radiating a warmth that felt real enough. His eyes, however, moved past Julian, landing on Maja. It was the briefest flicker, a scientist's glance at a prized specimen. And this must be the miracle herself. Maja crossed her arms, a solid wall of teenage skepticism. Thorne's smile didn't falter. He turned his attention back to Julian, placing a hand on his shoulder and guiding him. Come, let me show you what we've built. We'll get Renata settled in the infirmary, and Maja can go through a simple, non-invasive screening, just a baseline. Ren caught Julian's eye. Her expression was a clear warning, but Julian nodded, his own need for this to be real, for this to be salvation, overriding everything. He wanted to believe in the warm smile and the firm handshake. The laboratory was a scientist's heaven. Gleaming chrome sequencers lined the walls. Holographic displays shimmered with genetic code, and robotic arms moved with silent, fluid precision. A part of Julian that had been dormant for years, the part that lived for data and discovery, began to wake up. This was redemption. This was where his penitence ended. As Thorne guided him past a bank of cryo-storage units, he gestured with his chin toward a massive blast door at the far end of the hall. It was sealed tight, painted with stark red and yellow biohazard symbols. A dedicated BSL-4 wing, Thorne said, his voice dropping into a tone of manufactured solemnity. We lost a good team in there containing a breach last year. Julian stopped, the air growing cold around him. What happened? A tragedy, Thorne said, his gaze fixed on the door. But the data they secured advanced our work by a decade. Their sacrifice was not in vain. The words hung in the sterile air. A simple, brutal equation. Lives for data. The chill that touched Julian was sharp, a sliver of ice in the warmth of his returning hope. He looked at his mentor, at the calm, pragmatic face, and saw the cold calculus beneath. The medical suite was a white box. Bed, chair, monitors. It felt less like a patient room and more like a pristine containment cell. 2 medics, their faces impassive behind masks, worked with an efficiency that felt inhuman. They drew Maja's blood, their movements practiced, impersonal. One of them affixed a small, wireless biosensor to her temple. Just relax for a few minutes while we run the initial panel, the woman said, her voice muffled. Then they were gone, the door hissing shut behind them, leaving Maja alone in the humming silence. She sat on the edge of the medical bed, her worn boots planted on the polished white floor. She felt the biosensor on her skin, a foreign, crawling touch. Her instincts, honed by 2 years of survival, screamed at her. This wasn't safety, this was observation. Her eyes scanned the room, cataloging everything: the single door, the featureless walls, the array of monitors beside the bed. The name was a prayer whispered against the cracked vinyl of the dashboard. Renata Garza. Julian had said it to himself 100 times since they left the ruins of the CDC outpost, a 2-word mantra against the grinding emptiness of the road. Each syllable was a piece of Sarah's last breath, a final, desperate instruction. He glanced at Maja in the passenger seat. Her hoodie was up, a gray cowl that shadowed her face. Her profile was a sharp, stubborn line against the blur of dead factories that clawed at the sky. He cataloged her condition with the detached precision of a diagnosis. Respiration normal. No visible signs of fever or distress. Nutritional intake minimal but adequate. She was a variable, the most critical one, in an equation he had to solve. She caught his stare. What? Nothing. Just checking on you. The words were sterile, clinical. He might as well have been asking a lab sample how it was feeling. Maja turned back to the window. I'm fine. The silence that followed was heavier than the miles of rust and ruin stretching around them. They drove for another hour before the sound began, a low, collective groan that seemed to rise from the asphalt itself. Julian's hands tightened on the wheel. Ahead, where a highway overpass had collapsed into a ramp of broken concrete, they spilled onto the road. Dozens of them. Then 100, the CHV. They moved with the shambling, inexorable pull of a tide drawn by the engine's vibration. Julian's mind raced. Reverse course. Find an alternate route. Calculate fuel expenditure versus risk of engagement. Stop the car, Maja said, her voice flat. He looked at her, then back at the approaching horde. We can't. Stop the car. She was already unbuckling her seatbelt, her eyes fixed not on the infected, but on a skeletal fuel tanker lying on its side in a shallow ditch 50 yards away. A faded, peeling decal for a petroleum company was still visible on its rusted flank. He slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on loose gravel. Maja, what are you doing? Get back in. She was already out, grabbing a fist-sized chunk of concrete from the roadside. Her movements were fluid, economical. No panic, just purpose. She looked back at him, her expression unreadable. Stay here. She scrambled up the embankment, moving parallel to the road, keeping the tanker between herself and the horde. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs, a useless, frantic drum. This was wrong. He was the protector. She was the asset, the precious genetic key. He reached for the door handle, but froze as he saw her reach the tanker. She knelt beside the massive, corroded cap of its fuel tank, wedging her pry bar into the seam. With a grunt of effort, it popped open. The groans of the infected grew louder, a hungry chorus. Some of them were turning, their vacant eyes drawn to her movement. Maja didn't hesitate. She stood, took aim, and threw the piece of concrete with all her strength against the tanker's steel body. The rock struck with a loud, ringing clang. She threw another, and another. The sharp, percussive sound echoed across the dead landscape, a dinner bell. The horde shifted. Its mindless attention, once fixed on the car, was now drawn to the louder, more immediate noise. They began to drift, stumbling and clawing their way toward the tanker. Maja slid back down the embankment and sprinted to the car, yanking the passenger door open and throwing herself inside. Go. Now. Julian stomped on the accelerator, the engine screaming as the car lurched forward, leaving the diverted horde behind. He risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The infected were swarming the fuel tanker, a writhing mass of senseless hunger. He looked at Maja. Her knuckles were scraped raw, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. A bitter satisfaction flickered in her eyes before she hit it, pulling her hood further over her face. He had tried to protect a specimen. A survivor had just saved his life. They found the scavenger town an hour before dusk. It was an old auto plant, a brick and steel corpse ringed with walls of junked cars and razor wire. Smoke from oil drum fires stained the gray air. The price of entry was a quarter of their remaining fuel and a box of antibiotics. Inside, It was a hive of quiet paranoia. Faces watched them from shadowed doorways, gaunt and hungry. The leader was a barrel-chested man with a patchy beard and a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. Julian laid out their last sterile bandages and a bottle of iodine on a crate. "We need food, canned goods, and water." The leader grunted, poking at the supplies with a grimy finger. A man behind him dissolved into a fit of wet, rattling coughs. Julian's training took over, an instinct he couldn't suppress. "That sounds like secondary bacterial pneumonia," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a doctor on rounds. "He needs a broad-spectrum antibiotic. Amoxicillin, if you have it." The leader's eyes, dull and uninterested moments before, snapped into focus. They flicked from Julian's face to Maja, who stood silently behind him. A slow, predatory understanding dawned on his features. "A doctor," the leader mused, his voice dropping. "Not many of you left." He leaned forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper that coiled in the smoky air. "Heard a story on the SCOV radio. Some science man from the old government, traveling with a girl. A special girl. They say she can't get sick." Julian felt a cold dread crystallize in his stomach. He had sealed their fate with a diagnosis. "She's my daughter. She's not immune." The leader smiled, a joyless parting of lips. "We'll see." He gestured with the shotgun. "The girl stays. You can have your food. Maybe you even earn her back. We got a lot of sick folk." Julian didn't think. He grabbed the crate and hurled it at the leader's face. The man stumbled back, shouting in surprise. Julian shoved Maja toward a gap in the barricade. "Run!" The world erupted in noise. The blast of the shotgun was deafening, splintering the wooden wall beside Julian's head. He fired back with the pistol Sarah had given him, the recoil jarring his arm. A searing heat tore through his left bicep, a sudden, shocking fire that stole his breath. He staggered, but kept moving, firing blindly behind him as he pushed Maja through the gap. They scrambled over a pile of rusted engine blocks and ran, the shouts and gunfire of the town fading behind them. They found Wren's clinic near midnight, a small dark shape huddled off a forgotten road. It had been a veterinary office once. The sign, hanging from a single hinge, still showed the faded silhouette of a dog. Julian leaned against the doorframe, his left arm a useless, throbbing weight. Blood, dark in the moonlight, soaked his sleeve. The door creaked open. A woman stood there, holding an old oil lantern. She had tired, sharp eyes, and her dark hair was pulled back from her face. She held a crowbar like she knew how to use it. "What do you want? Renata Garza?" Julian's voice was a ragged whisper. "Sarah Croft sent me." The woman's posture softened, almost imperceptibly. The crowbar lowered a few inches. "Get inside." The clinic smelled of antiseptic fighting, a losing battle against dust and decay. Wren guided him to an examination table, the vinyl cool against his skin. She cut away his jacket sleeve with a practiced efficiency. While she worked, cleaning the wound with a dwindling supply of alcohol, she spoke. "I remember you from her stories. The brilliant Dr. Croft, the man who was going to save the world from a lab." There was no admiration in her voice, only a weary accounting of fact. Maja stood in the corner, a silent observer, her arms crossed tight against her chest. Wren wrapped a clean bandage around his arm, her knots tight and professional. She looked from his wound to Maja, then back to him. "She told me you were obsessed," Wren said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of a judgment. "That you saw the world through a microscope. It's one thing to see a virus that way, Doctor. It's another to see your own daughter." Julian flinched. The words hurt more than the bullet wound. "I'm trying to save her. To save everyone." "Are you?" Wren met his gaze, her dark eyes unwavering. "Have you asked her what she wants? Or is she just another one of your experiments?" The question hung in the sterile air, an indictment. Before he could form a defense, a new sound intruded, a high-pitched electronic whine from outside. It grew louder, passing directly overhead. A reconnaissance drone. Julian's blood ran cold. The tracker Sarah had sewn into his jacket, a failsafe, a beacon. Vance knew where they were. Wren's face was grim. "We have to go. Now. There's a trading post on the river, the confluence. I can get you passage west." Her promise to Sarah was a palpable thing in the small room, a debt to be paid. The confluence was a maze of rotting piers and half-sunk barges under a sliver of moon. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and damp earth. They moved through the shadows toward a rickety-looking barge when the night was split apart by the crack of a rifle. A spotlight flared to life, pinning them against a stack of crates. Figures in clean tactical gear moved in, their discipline a stark contrast to the ramshackle chaos of the docks. A voice, amplified and chillingly calm, echoed from a comms unit. "My boy would be her age now. We do this so no other father has to watch his son choke on his own blood. Secure the asset. We end this." Julian saw him then, a man in a perfectly pressed uniform standing on a higher pier, Major Gideon Vance. He raised his pistol, but another shot sent splinters flying from the crate near his head. They were pinned. "Go," Wren yelled. She broke from cover, drawing their fire. She ran, not away, but toward a rusty fuel drum, shoving it over with a loud crash. It was the diversion they needed. As the soldiers' attention shifted, a bullet caught her, spinning her to the ground with a cry of pain. Julian grabbed Maja's arm and pulled her toward the barge. They scrambled aboard, casting off the ropes as bullets chewed the water around them. Wren dragged herself to the edge of the pier, clutching her leg, and tumbled onto the deck just as the current caught them, pulling the barge out into the dark, churning river. The sounds of gunfire faded into the distance, replaced by the lapping of water against the hull. Wren was on her back, her face pale and beaded with sweat. Her pant leg was soaked with a spreading stain of black blood. Maja was instantly at her side, ripping a strip of cloth from her own shirt. Her movements were practiced, sure. She wrapped it high and tight around Wren's thigh, cinching it into a tourniquet. Julian fumbled with his medical bag, his hands shaking. He opened it. A few bandages, some expired painkillers, useless vials. He clutched the empty bag, the full weight of his failure pressing down on his chest. He watched his daughter, her small hands working with a desperate competence he had never taught her, saving a life while he could only watch. Wren grimaced through the pain, her eyes finding his in the gloom. "Sarah told you to find me for a reason, Doctor," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "Before we go any further, you need to ask yourself one question. What happens if the Aegis Sanctuary isn't looking for a cure? What if they're looking for a weapon?" The world outside ended in rust and rot. The world inside began with a hiss of compressed air. A slab of reinforced titanium, thick as a man's chest, slid sideways into the mountain. Light spilled out, so white and pure it made Julian flinch. It was not the thin, watery sunlight of a dying world, but a clean artificial glare that scoured the grime from his vision. He breathed, and for the first time in years, the air did not taste of dust and decay. It smelled of nothing, a sterile, ozonic void that promised a world scrubbed clean. Beside him, Wren leaned against the rock wall, her weight off her injured leg. Her face, usually a mask of hardened pragmatism, was a blank slate of exhaustion. Only her eyes moved, scanning the impossibly clean corridor that stretched before them, her skepticism a tangible thing. Maja stood just behind Julian, a small shadow swallowed by the entrance. Her hand was a knot in the back of his patched jacket. He could feel her trembling, or perhaps that was him. Hope was a fragile, unfamiliar muscle, and his was cramping with the strain. A man emerged from the light, walking toward them with a smooth, unhurried gait. He was the sanctuary made flesh. A pressed white lab coat, a crisp button-down shirt, silver hair trimmed with geometric precision. Dr. Aris Thorne had not aged so much as he had been preserved. Julian. Thorne's smile was warm, but it did not reach his eyes. Those eyes, a pale, analytical blue, swept over them, cataloging their filth, their exhaustion, their desperation. My God, we'd almost given up hope. Julian's own voice was a dry rasp. "Aris, you got my message." "Weeks ago," Thorne said, his gaze lingering for a moment on Maja. "We've been preparing for your arrival. Come, let's get you all situated. You look like you've been through hell." Thorne's hand on his shoulder felt less like a welcome and more like an appraisal. He led them through corridors that hummed with the quiet confidence of limitless power. Polished chrome reflected their ragged forms back at them, ghosts haunting a pristine machine. "Renata, is it?" Thorne gestured to a medic who appeared as if from nowhere. "Our medical team will see to you. And Maja. We need to run some simple, non-invasive screenings, a baseline, just a precaution." Ren's gaze met Julian's. "Watch them," her eyes said. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He trusted Ren's instincts more than his own right now. Maja let go of his jacket, her face unreadable, and followed the medic with Ren limping beside her. "Let me show you what we've built, Julian," Thorne said, guiding him toward another set of doors. "What your work helped us preserve." The lab was a cathedral to science. Holographic displays floated in the air, shifting with cascades of data. Robotic arms performed delicate procedures in sealed chambers. The air vibrated with the low thrum of sequencers and centrifuges. It was everything he had dreamed of, a place where the world could be fixed. A profound sense of relief washed over him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. He had done it. He had brought Maja to salvation. "Incredible," Julian whispered. Thorne beamed, a proprietor showing off his finest acquisition. "We've made leaps, even without you." He gestured down a side corridor to a single heavy door marked with a stark red biohazard symbol. A quarantine lock glowed ominously. "We lost a good team in there containing a breach a few months back." Thorne's voice took on a tone of practiced solemnity. "Tragic. Excellent people. But the data they secured from the incident advanced our work by a decade. Their sacrifice was not in vain." A cold pocket formed in the pit of Julian's stomach. The words were right, the sentiment noble, but the delivery was hollow. It was the sound of a man calculating acceptable losses. The warm glow of the lab suddenly felt brittle. The medical suite was just as white, just as clean. Maja sat on the edge of a diagnostic bed, the paper crinkling beneath her. A nurse with a relentlessly pleasant smile had drawn 3 vials of her blood, talking the whole time about the fresh food in the commissary. Ren watched from a chair in the corner, her arms crossed, her expression stony. "All right, that's all we need for now," the nurse said, her smile unwavering. "The doctor will be in to see you shortly. Just relax." She left. The silence she left behind was heavy. Maja's eyes, always moving, always assessing, scanned the room. A bank of monitors glowed on the far wall, displaying streams of data. One was active, showing the results from a sample being processed in real time. Her sample. She slid off the bed. Ren didn't stop her. Maja moved closer to the screen, her worn boots silent on the polished floor. Most of it was a language she didn't understand. Leukocytes, platelet count, hematocrit. But then her eyes locked on one line, set apart from the others. ACV7 viral load quant. Beside it was not the simple negative she had been promised, not the 0 she expected. It was a number, a string of digits so long it seemed impossible. She didn't know what the units of measurement were, but she knew what a big number looked like. It was an astronomically high number. He had lied to her. The promise of safety, the warm welcome, the clean sheets. It was all a lie. The familiar cold terror of the road seeped back into her bones. This was not a sanctuary, it was a cage. Just as the thought solidified, a siren split the silence. Not a low warning, but a frantic. The heavy thump of the magnetic locks disengaging was the only warning. Then the lab door blew inward, a concussive blast of sound and pressure that sent a shower of white composite fragments across the polished floor. Dr. Thorne stood in the ruin of the doorway, framed by 2 Aegis security officers in gray tactical gear, their rifles held low and ready. His tailored lab coat was immaculate, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just unleashed. His eyes, however, were not calm. Behind his glasses, they were wide, darting from the fractured data on the main screen to Maja, cowering on the medical cot. "What have you done?" Thorne's voice was tight, a frayed wire of a thing. He strode into the room, his men fanning out behind him. "The truth, Thorne," Julian said, his voice a low growl. He placed himself between Thorne and Maja's cot. The ill-fitting Aegis coat he wore felt like a costume, a shroud for a man who no longer existed. It was never immunity. It's a parasite, a symbiotic deception. Thorne's gaze fixed on a secondary monitor, his mind processing the cascading lines of code and genomic sequencing with horrifying speed. The hope drained from his face, replaced by a sunken gray despair. But then, something else flickered there, a grasping, feverish light. He pointed a trembling finger at a specific data block. There, the protein markers. It's not a cure, no, but the masking compound her body produces. We can synthesize it, Julian. We can create a prophylactic, a suppressor. He looked from the screen to Maja, and his eyes were no longer those of a doctor. They were the eyes of a quartermaster calculating acceptable losses. We can still use her. A gunshot cracked from the hallway, followed by a burst of automatic fire. The Aegis men at the door flattened themselves against the wall, returning fire into the corridor. Vance's soldiers. Thorne ignored it. He was a zealot in a collapsing church, seeing only the one artifact he could save. She's a necessary sacrifice. The words hit Julian harder than the breach. Necessary sacrifice. The same cold, utilitarian logic he had used to justify leaving her behind all those years ago. The same monstrous calculus that had him chasing atonement for the world while he neglected his own daughter. In Thorne's desperate, righteous face, Julian saw the reflection of a man he despised, the man he had been. It was not an epiphany born of light, but of disgust, a black, final clarity. His redemption was not in a vial. It was not in a cure for mankind. It was in the small, trembling girl behind him. He made his choice. With a sweep of his arm, Julian sent the rack of sample vials crashing to the floor. The delicate glass tubes, each containing a drop of Maja's blood, shattered against the pristine tiles. The hope of a cure became a meaningless crimson smear under his boot. "Julian, no!" Thorne lunged forward. Julian turned and drove his fist into the main data terminal. The screen spider-webbed with cracks, then went dark. He ripped a heavy metal stool from the floor and brought it down again and again on the servers beneath the console. The rhythmic crunch of plastic and metal a counterpoint to the gunfire outside. He was destroying his life's work. He was throwing away the scientist to become the father. He grabbed Maja, pulling her small, shaking body from the cot. She stared at him, her eyes wide with a terror that was slowly being replaced by a dawning, fragile awe. "Get them!" Thorne screamed at his men, but it was too late. The firefight spilled into the lab. One of Thorne's guards went down, his gray uniform blossoming with red. A soldier in Vance's black tactical gear fell in the doorway. It was a three-way battle over a prize that no longer existed. Wren appeared from an adjoining supply room, a fire extinguisher in her hands. She met Julian's gaze and nodded once, a grim understanding passing between them. The compass rose on her forearm was a stark black mark against her skin. She pulled the pin and blanketed the doorway in a thick cloud of white foam, creating a momentary, blinding confusion. "This way," she yelled. Julian, holding Maja tight, followed her to a side wall. He knew this place. He knew its bones. Years ago, he had helped design the biocontainment protocols for this entire wing. He slammed his palm against a small, unmarked panel. It hissed open, revealing a keypad. He didn't hack it. He didn't have to. His fingers flew, tapping in a code that was a part of his soul. JAC MEC 1015. His initials, her birthday. An emergency override failsafe. A ghost of a father's love coded into the walls of a sterile fortress. He pressed the final key. "What did you do?" Wren asked, her voice sharp over the rising shriek of an alarm. "I reclaimed my work," Julian said. Throughout the central facility, heavy blast doors slammed shut with percussive, bone-jarring finality. From ceiling vents in the corridors, a pale, atomized gas began to pour. A level 4 quarantine purge. Sterilization. The move trapped the majority of both Vance's and Thorne's forces, sealing them in a tomb of their own making, forcing them into a desperate retreat or suffocation. The path ahead of them was clear. Ren kicked open a grated panel near the floor. Ventilation shaft. Let's go. Julian pushed Maja toward the opening. It was a black, cramped hole. He hesitated, but she did not. She scrambled inside without a second thought, her small body disappearing into the darkness. Her years of surviving in ruins had made her adept at this. She was more at home in the tight, treacherous spaces of the world than he was. He followed, Ren right behind him, pulling the grate shut. The shaft was claustrophobic, the air thick with dust, and the smell of old metal. Alarms blared in the distance, their sound muffled and distorted. All Julian could hear was the scrape of their bodies against the tunnel and their ragged, panicked breathing. Maja was a small shadow ahead of him,